Sharing the session. Yeah, we did. So you made sense. You can set the dates. Did you join the North Korean? The North Korean nice to meet you. Close. Everybody wants to be a captain. It's a very nice jacket. Different from the usual big one.
Are you looking for a stick? No.
Yeah, for those adapters to to electricity. You can plug in against the rest of the world.
What are you looking for?
It's something to plug in my computer, but I don't have the adapter.
I don't know. Maybe Marcus can ask before the session starts if somebody has one. I can bring one tomorrow.
No, I forgot it in the hotel.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, Mary Young.
Oh, Mary Young.
Yeah.
Oh,
Criminal Genetic. Oh, really? You're doing sex or?
I've done a year before.
I'm working on kind of other topics. It would have been interesting. I had a proposal with INET, the kind of fight round, which would have involved going there, but then.
Were you based in?
Now I'm based in Amsterdam.
start the first afternoon session about now. Please take your seat. And I would like to give, first of all, before we start the actual content of the afternoon session, I would like to give the floor for a few minutes to Franziska, who has a special intro session to have now.
Thank you, Marcus. Well, as you know, over the years, a large tax justice community has been built, and it is really the result of so many people's hard work and inspiration. This works, yeah. And what we like to do is honor a few people for their contribution to building this community. Last year, 2 people were honored, 2 more this year. Neither of them know as to that they've been nominated. So the first person has really brightened our lives with a monthly podcast. And that is Naomi Fowler.
I don't know what it is.
Well, all the people who work for tax justice need to be protected, therefore we give them shields. The second person I can't see in the room, and he's been very influential and aspirational. He certainly inspired me. I read one of his papers about international taxation in an accounting journal going way back in 1992, and jokingly we call him the grandfather of tax justice. He's around, but he just disappeared for a while. That is Sol Picciotto. So Sol's not here, but hopefully we give it to him when he comes. So please, applause for Sol. Okay, now back to the proceedings.
Thank you very much. Okay, on the dark side, we start the first presentation with Jan Fichtner from University of Amsterdam, the research project coordinate there. I think it's a very interesting thing that you've got going there, and you are reporting to us about it, about what you've been doing since March 2016 there. The floor is yours.
First of all, thanks a lot for organizing. I think for organizing the workshop and for inviting me. I'm going to speak about a little case study I've been doing about the Cayman Islands. Actually, I've been doing it before joining CorpNet. Why did I study the Cayman Islands? Because I did my PhD on various aspects of the hedge fund industry. And you realize pretty quickly when you study hedge funds that about 60% of all global hedge fund assets are domiciled, legally domiciled in the Cayman Islands. And to me, this was really surprising and astonishing because it's such a tiny jurisdiction there in the Caribbean with just 50,000 people. So this was kind of my basic puzzle or motivation to study the Cayman Islands. And as you probably all know, it's a British overseas territory, similar to the British Virgin Islands, Bermuda, and other crown territories. There's also another reason to study the Cayman Islands, except for hedge funds. This year I took from a publication I call the offshore intensity ratio. Basically, it's a very simple ratio dividing the amount of foreign assets, that is banking assets, direct investment assets, portfolio investment assets, booked in the jurisdiction, divided by the GDP of the particular jurisdiction. And it gives a very simple ratio, kind of how intensive this jurisdiction acts as an offshore jurisdiction, how intensively it attracts foreign capital. And there Cayman Islands has a score of about 1,500, way larger than all the other offshore jurisdictions. So it's very, very intensive. And it's in absolute terms, it's large as well. So it's over $4 trillion in foreign assets. So it's a bit smaller than Luxembourg and the Netherlands, but compared to the others, British Virgin Islands, Bermuda, etc., it's very large. And some contributions of the paper, I think, first of all, as far as I know, there has been no study really taking into account all the data that is now available to us. Just a small caveat, we don't have data on trusts, which I think we have data for on Jersey. I think it's about 400 billion pounds in trusts, so it's probably even larger than the Cayman Islands. And also we don't have much data about China, because China doesn't participate in the IMF and BIS surveys. And coming from political science or IPE, I think my main contribution here is to see the Cayman Islands as kind of an Anglo-American offshore jurisdiction. It's one triangle with the US and with the UK, or with New York and London to be more precise. Very quickly, the banking sector you see here is from the Bank of International Settlements, who measures the locational banking statistics. They include also intragroup transactions, so they're larger, and the consolidated banking statistics. You see very strong growth. Even the financial crisis didn't really change this fundamentally. The LBS with the intragroup transactions declined a little bit, but the consolidated banking statistics still at an all-time high, so the crisis didn't really impact Cayman fundamentally in banking. Yes, we have data from the BIS, quite granular data about the geography of the banking sector in Cayman, and we see that the United States and Japan are really the dominating jurisdictions here, each with over 30%. Switzerland plays an important role as well, UK a little bit, Germany, but after that it's very small shares there. You can go into detail here. There are also other potential exposures going to, for example, German banks have the largest exposure in derivatives, etc. But it's in the paper if you want to go into detail. So banking was the first segment, about 1 trillion more or less. The next one is direct investment, which is much smaller, which is about $500 billion. The IMF started to collect data since 2009. And first of all, direct investment, don't think of greenfield investment or anything. It's majority shares in funds or corporations. So it's basically, this is all related to finance, because, I mean, it's obvious, Cayman Islands cannot support any large-scale foreign direct investment involving the physical construction of anything. Again, the US is very dominant here, both in inward direct investment and outward direct investment. The Netherlands, Luxembourg, very prominent. Even the IMF has identified those as the dominant global direct investment conduits. So the Cayman Islands is involved here as well. And the third really important segment, and by far the largest, is portfolio investment. So any kind of investment that is held for financial gain. Here I've taken data from the IMF and also from the US Treasury to show the position of the Cayman Islands in the international system of portfolio investment. So what you see is the US is the most important jurisdiction for incoming portfolio investment, but also Japan plays a very, quite surprisingly large role. There wasn't really anything in the literature about Japan being an important investor in the Cayman Islands, and Hong Kong as well. Again, there might be a lot of Chinese portfolio investment that we don't see. But what's really interesting is, so the dark kind of arrow coming from the US And there's another one, the gray one, going back to the US. This is Cayman portfolio investment into the US. It's much larger. It's about 1.4 trillion US dollars, and it's actually the second largest bilateral portfolio investment relation on the planet. Only US investment into the UK is larger. So it's we don't talk about any random tax haven somewhere like the Seychelles or even Panama. I think it's very small. It's a really key component of global finance, I think. And probably the major reason for this is, again, kind of my starting point, that the majority of the hedge fund industry is based in the Cayman Islands. And hedge funds are based there because there are no direct taxes, very relaxed oversight. But at the same time, and I think it's really important, the Cayman regulator is also sophisticated. So it can react very quickly to new international legislation. It's very well connected to what's been called advanced business services firms, so the big four accounting firms. Also, it's called the CIMA, the regulator. Regularly, staff on the CIMA has been recruited from these large international accounting firms and others. So they have expertise, and they can create trust. On the one hand, trust for international investors, but also lax regulation. I think this is very important because other jurisdictions simply can't replicate this combination of sophisticated but also lax regime. And especially with hedge funds, you can easily see the connection to the US and the UK because 70% of these assets in the Cayman Islands are managed in New York, or kind of the greater New York area, and 60% in London. So I think that's really a triangle there between New York, London, and the Cayman Islands. And you can also see that the Cayman is quite sophisticated because they developed specific legislation for Japanese investors. They went several times to Japan, and they really tailored the jurisdiction to fit the Japanese legislation. So that's the major reason why Japan has played such an important role here in the data. Basically, what I would conclude from this case study, as I said before, is a key node in global finance. It's not just any kind of money laundering center or any in periphery. It's really important. It's an Anglo-American triangle, and it's also been portrayed in the literature as kind of an upmarket center. So it has to preserve investor trust, and that's why I think it also, or it has in the past reacted to international pressure because it has to maintain this image as kind of a respectable upmarket overseas. So briefly, what could be done? I think country by country reporting obviously would do a lot to kind of bring a little bit transparency in there. There is a little bit data. We at Corporate work with the Orbis database, for example, and there is some data there about companies in the Cayman Islands, but it's not much. And then especially trust assets, as far as I'm aware, all the kind of transparency initiatives also by the UK always exclude trusts. So they say we can be more transparent in banking or maybe portfolio investment, but not in trusts. And trust is kind of I think the very Anglo-American common law specialty. So there's no data, we don't know, but I'm pretty sure that it's this is unique about this kind of common law jurisdictions. And then very briefly, because it's directly connected to our topic today, I've joined the CorpNet project in March. It's based at the University of Amsterdam. One main focus is to study the global interlocking directorates using a big data approach. I'm working more on a sub-project on the concentration of ownership through passive index funds. They're not really, well, their investment strategy is passive, but they're not passive owners, like BlackRock, Vanguard, etc. But recently we've started a small side project because we have this pretty nice database to see what we can do to further the identification of tax havens. And this is one measure. Here on the x-axis down there, you see the GDP of the jurisdiction, and on the left-hand side is what's called Orbis sum. It's the sum of the revenue of the companies domiciled in the jurisdiction. So you see most countries are kind of on the same line there, and we have a few outliers above. It's pretty obviously Cayman, British Virgin Islands, Gibraltar. There's also on the left-hand side the Marshall Islands. Colombia, I was told by my colleague, is they have specific data problems, so they should probably be excluded. But that's one approach that we're taking. There's also another one. That's a graph a colleague has created. Basically, it looks at the jurisdictions and checks the number of subsidiaries elsewhere. So, kind of in blue there, you have the British Virgin Islands, and it sets the number of foreign subsidiaries in relation to the GDP of the British Virgin Islands. So KY is the Cayman Islands, Cyprus, Marshall Islands, Bermuda, Luxembourg, and Latvia are really the big and central ones in this respect. But we've just begun this a couple of weeks ago, so this is work in progress.
Thank you very much, Jan. That was very inspiring already. And we will go now into a little bit more into the subject of Cayman, I think, as well. And Mayhem will give us the next presentation. She's a PhD student at Cambridge in sociology. If I'm not mistaken. Oh, and I thought you had.
Yeah, I have one more thing to ask you.
I was going to talk about my PhD research, but I'm going to actually respond to that quickly first because I've got a few projects on the go. So one of the things that we have a great deal of difficulty in finding is what actually happens in these black boxes of offshore, where some industries or some financial products like hedge funds or trusts or other products aren't regulated enough that they need to be reported on a regular basis to some sort of regulatory body. So this is where social sciences come in, and anthropologists and sociologists come in, because I worked for about 6 months in the University of California, Irvine, with a legal anthropologist named Bill Maurer, and he runs something called the Institute for Money, Technology, and Financial Inclusion. And he gave me some really good tips on how to look at spaces that are really difficult to penetrate, like offshore. And so what I did was I actually did half of a project, which I'm going to continue on after in probably a few months from now. But this is a little write-up that I did for this particular project on trusts. And the title is called "The House Always Wins: Trends Offshore Pre- and Post-Financial Crisis." And so in the summer of 2015, I found myself sitting at a bar in the Cayman Islands in an affluent neighborhood of 7 Mile Beach and having a conversation with a senior British lawyer who was advising me on how to go about doing my research on the future of offshore financial centers, which is what I posed as my research question: what is the future of offshore? The person who was giving me this advice had been a partner at a very successful law practice, specializing in high finance in another British overseas territory, and had come to Cayman to replicate that success to open up another firm. By the end of the evening, our conversation had moved on to expensive scotch and expensive mistakes, the latter dealing with politically significant current events such as wars, debt crises, and petrol politics. Our other bar companion that evening, a young Canadian executive, mused, you know what, we're pretty lucky living in here in Cayman. You know, the financial crisis didn't seem to have much of an effect here. And everyone is still driving around in Audis, and real estate here is actually quite good. And that was in July of 2015. And the British lawyer exclaimed, you're right. You know, it is good. And you know what I've learned from the financial crisis? What? You know what? And the lawyer went on to explain how he loved that the news at that time in July was focused on wars in Africa, the Middle East, and other places, because it took the spotlight away from places like the Cayman Islands. And if there was anything that he had learned from the most recent financial crisis, was that no matter what was happening in the US or anywhere else in the world, places like the Cayman Islands would always do all right, because they existed for the exit of money from places experiencing crises and unstable economies. So the proverbial house offshore always wins. And so from there, qualitatively, I started to look at this one particular journal called Trusts and Trustees. It's sort of a quasi-academic slash more professional publication. It's been around for a few years. And because it's a quasi-academic slash professional publication, it really gives you insight on what trustees are going through at the moment, what are hot topics, and what sort of issues they're coming across. And so what I did was I went through 350 articles over the last about 20 years of that publication. Anything that was available through their online database, I went through. I used a qualitative analysis software called Atlas TI, and what I did was I coded each and every one of these articles that had anything to do with the British Virgin Islands and the Cayman Islands, because I was interested in 2 British overseas territories. Also, my previous supervisor, Bill, had written quite extensively on the British Virgin Islands, so he had quite a bit of legal anthropology and expertise on it. And so what I really found was that there were a lot of codes that you could code for. And so anytime a mention of the Cayman Islands or the British Islands went up, I would code it. And then I started, because I didn't know where to look and what to look for, I started looking for terms. I looked for certain case laws, and I looked for certain words that were really mentioned frequently in these places. And so I'll show you what it looks like. This is a snapshot of my codes once they were compiled. And so you guys will see that I've grouped them into the most frequently occurring on the left-hand side. And then on the right-hand side, you'll see just it in alphabetical order. So if you're a lawyer and you specialize in trusts, you'll probably understand this, but if you're a regular person like me, you probably won't. And so this is where I got stuck. And if anybody can help me, that would be great. But you need to know a bit of what happens in trusts and what's hot in certain jurisdictions. So you'll know that, for example, you need to know, which geographies like to use the Cayman Islands, because everyone has their own boutique trust and tax haven. Everyone has their own boutique place to go to stash their wealth. And so I noticed that during financial crisis before, and this is just data from reading these things and from really my preliminary research in the Cayman Islands. And that was a lot of bitter family disputes occurred just before and after, especially after the crisis. And what happens during a crisis is that everyone really gets scared, and they reevaluate what they hold as assets, and that's when family disputes kind of come about. And they usually like to resolve things outside of a public legal system, and so they'll forum shop. So they'll shop for a forum to take their case so that they can battle that out in private. And should they need to use a court system, I suspect they may want to use somewhere like the Cayman Islands to have that disagreement played out. So that's what I have so far for that. We'll set that aside, and I'll go on to my current project now, which is my PhD. I hope that answered your question. So for my PhD, I'll begin with my background. I used to be a tax collector for Canada Revenue Agency for about 5 years. And I realized that knocking on doors, going after plumbers and dentists, was not as fruitful of a job that it could have been for me. And I decided to leave my job after about 5 years to do a master's, to study people who I thought were the ultimate tax evader. I thought they all would pick up and move to the Cayman Islands. So for my master's, I actually did a year's worth of field work in the Cayman Islands, and I studied how it became an offshore financial center. So it was a master's in communications, and so I used anthropology to really look at the history of how the island developed from a primarily maritime economy in the 60s and the 50s and before, to a banking center, to what is now a very successful offshore financial center. And when I finished that master's thesis, I realized that there were two worlds down there. There's a world of this offshore financial center, but there's also a indigenous population. They're the Caymanians. And so there are two very separate things that are going on, and one thing really takes over the other, but the quieter voice, the locals, really use the voice of the financial industry, they use the platform of the financial industry to really try to get their views across. So sometimes we see some mixed signals, and sometimes we have to think about who is actually speaking, why they're speaking it, and why they're using that particular forum to get their point across. So when you are bashing the Cayman Islands, you have to really be clear on what specifically you're bashing, because there is still 20,000 of those people who are Caymanians. So during my master's, I also did about 30 or 40 formal interviews. And I realized a lot of the lawyers, trustees, and people working in finance there were trained at Oxford and Cambridge. And I realized that there was a bit of an old boys club down there, which was, I mean, I don't know if it's surprising or not, but I realized that, you know, part and parcel to this type of industry is that it brings a lot of one kind of social and educational upbringing. And so I decided to go there to train myself to get into the world. And that's why I'm doing my PhD at Cambridge. So I decided to conduct something Brooke Harrington calls immersion ethnography. And what she does is, if you guys have heard of Brooke's work, she trained to become a trustee and became part of the Society of Trustee and Estate Planners to understand how this type of profession breeds socioeconomic inequality. So I'm not doing something that's exactly what she does, but what I'm really doing is I'm getting myself into an environment where I'm starting to understand some of the educational and the social backgrounds of some of the people who eventually end up in places that operate offshore financial centers. Am I first? Okay. So one of my biggest methodological problems is, how do I measure and assess values, ideas, impact, and what the activities actually mean in a sociological context to bring back to my research. Because it's not a quantitative study, it's going to be richly qualitative. I'm trying to really get into the minds of professionals who live and work in these offshore financial centers to actually understand how the system works from the offshore perspective. So there's a lot of writing about how offshore works and what happens, and we know a lot about the transactions, but we don't actually know a whole lot about what people think, especially the ones who work in these places on a day-to-day basis. And so my previous example, in terms of the trusts and trustees, about talking to that lawyer at the bar, you know, it really gave us a good insight into sort of things that go on that we may not see so easily. And so I gave Prem my 13,000-page report on it, and hopefully he'll be able to provide some advice. Thank you.
Thank you for excellent presentations. First, a confession, I have not read your report yet. Will take a bit of time, obviously, to read and digest. But there's a lot of food for thought in both papers. As I looked at the slides which were sent to me, I sort of wondered about the political geography of these places. What kind of democratic political institutions do they actually have, which are so comfortable with opaqueness and sleaze? Often when you look at some of these places, again I mentioned Jersey because that's where I met John when he was running a tax haven. They had no political parties at that time, still aren't any. Every member of parliament at that time was a minister, so therefore no official opposition. When I met John, there was no written record of any parliamentary debate. You have to buy an audio cassette, 30 minutes for £10, so that you could figure out what was actually being discussed. There was one newspaper that was run by a very senior politician, and almost impossible to write any critical article or get newsletters, any letters published. So my sort of one question is, what are the political institutions of these places? Second, why does the UK approve them? Okay, and does that tell us a story about the domination of financial elites over the UK? Prince Charles can knock off many letters to ministers. Why has he never written about tax havens and asked any questions about this? He can ask questions about anything and then say, by the way, my letters should not be released. So is the whole of our political establishment complicit in this? I suspect it is. Britain, after all, has negotiated special rights for many of its overseas territories and crown dependencies with the European Union. They can trade with the European Union without any of the obligations which apply to the members, or even making the financial contributions to the same extent. So again, why? So, and obviously there are implications for all of this onshore as well, because if we are losing tax revenues, as has been pointed out in earlier sessions today, which has implications for human rights, justice, equality, and everything else. So it would be helpful to know the social political context of these places. So, second is, this also tells us a story about globalization. All that seems to matter is financial advantage and little else. So therefore, how on earth is this kind of capitalism really legitimized? The whole thing is opaque. Why do we run along with this opaqueness? Or is it that people are so mystified by this that they don't actually ask questions about this? So there are, if so, what kind of strategies are used, and how can we then demystify this? Because if we can demystify it, then probably some action is possible on this. Now, part of the reason why it's business as usual even after the financial crisis in these places is because larger states in the EU, UK, US, they have bailed out the financial system. So chances are a lot of these hedge funds were sitting on massive gambles, probably derivatives, for example, which could open them to a considerable exposure. So their exposure, in a sense, has been bailed out, bought off by other states. But the taxpayers in other states have not exactly been rewarded for this, not even in terms of information. So again, there are broader questions about the broader global political economy as well. To some extent, these places are really fictitious, because the cash isn't actually, though they may have booked the assets there, the cash isn't actually sitting there. It is probably doing some round tripping, probably floating around in cyberspace or in other places, earning something, or perhaps gambling on something. So in many ways, the data is very helpful in helping us to understand how what happens at these places, but it actually begs bigger questions about the political economy and why this happens and how this happens. And of course, this has not happened overnight. this has been going on for quite some time. So what we are in many ways witnessing is modern piracy. Somebody is taking all the rewards and advantages, little secret clubs, and those clubs are not really challenged. So this is a modern case of piracy. Newspapers headlines have been full about Philip Green and the unacceptable face of capitalism, but little attention is sort of devoted to this, and it really deserves far more attention. So thank you for illuminating some aspects of this, and I certainly will look forward to reading your report and your PhD. I'm sure it will take me a couple of months to do that. Thank you.
Maybe I can add, this business model doesn't seem to be in decline, or the market doesn't seem to be shrinking very much yet. Trinidad and Tobago last week, I think, was the last new entrant to this offshore game. I think there's no colonial active protecting power anymore in place there, but still there's a new entrant in the Caribbean in that market. So perhaps we can now open the floor for questions.
Thank you so much for the presentation, Jan and May. It was very insightful and impressive to see the move you made from being a tax collector and being interested to Cayman Island to working offshore. But Jan, my question is addressed to you. The last slide on your presentation on CorpNet, I would like to understand the methodology that you use to come up with a number of companies with subsidiaries. Because if you take a country like the US, for instance, I guess it's based on publicly available information. That means there's numbers of companies, and obviously I didn't know whether the scale was limited to a specific geographical area for companies or if it's larger. If you explain a little bit on that, that would be great. Thank you.
Maybe we can do three in a go.
I just had a question for you. It might be very silly and banal question. A case that I've been looking at involves the daughter of the Uzbek president, and she was taking large bribes from telecommunications, Swedish, Dutch, Russian telecommunication companies. They were going into the accounts of companies in the Gibraltar and Hong Kong that were held by two people. But all that money was then wired through Parex Bank in Latvia, which is known for being the launderer to the Russian stars, the mafia. And then it was also to the Cayman Islands, where it was put into a portfolio firm who then spread the cash out through Luxembourg and Switzerland and Ireland. And I just wondered, from an outside perspective, you think, well, wouldn't someone be asking questions why seemingly two Uzbek proxy people who low-level Uzbek people have hundreds of millions of US dollars sloshing around their accounts? Why wasn't anyone? Is there any regulation, any thought that anyone is incumbent to even ask these questions and stuff? So that's really.
Just a question from me. I think you've set up the investigation really, really well. I mean, I was fascinated to hear more about this idea of immersive ethnography and having a different approach. I guess there are two questions. One of them is access and how you can get access to ethnography in this context. And second, I don't know how far you are in research, but if you could give us a flavour or a story, just like Bill Moore does sometimes, give us a really interesting story that you thought reflected this point about how these gatekeepers of finance think. So if you could give us just a little flavour, I don't know what, of a conversation perhaps that struck you, that would be interesting.
Okay, what's now?
First, okay. Thanks, great questions. Maybe first of all to PRAM, why does the UK tolerate these offshore centers in its own jurisdictions? And in one paper I found explanation that the Treasury just thought that, well, the amount of taxes we lose is certainly less than the capital attracted to the city. So it was a kind of maybe one approach to explain this. But then again, we are directly at the topic of financial elites kind of dominating the UK. The question regarding the graph, well, the the Orbis database is quite extensive. So, for example, for the Cayman Islands, I think there are about 50 or 60,000 companies domiciled in the Cayman Islands. So, which is of course not complete, but it's quite extensive. And basically, again, what we did is take the number of foreign subsidiaries and to set it in relation to the GDP. So I don't know if that kind of really answers your question. It's not complete, but I think it's one of the most complete databases. There are, I think in total it's about 100 million firms or so. And
so, yeah, that's just for clarification. So you took the legal entities, registered domicile, islands, and you looked downstream in the chain of ownership, what were subsidiaries of those
somewhere else
legal entities elsewhere.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And the question with the Uzbek case, why no questions asked? I think the Cayman Islands has a very one-sided kind of understanding. They follow their international legal obligations, but they will never initiate something on their own. So when the IRS or the UK, when they come with an official request, they'll deal with it. But for that to happen, they need to have information about the case before. So it's really difficult, I think, that's why there are only a couple of central questions. So they're kind of fulfilling what's written there in the international obligation, but not more, just to keep there. And there's another interesting case I did mention, actually was reviewed by the Financial Times, that there was some hedge fund nominee directors sitting on the boards of, I think, 300 or 400 hedge funds. So it's, of course, impossible to fulfill the fiduciary duties. And afterwards, it was published. They started a survey and asked around in their investor base, and then slowly they're doing something about it, only after international pressure.
So my answer to that one would be, there's actually so for the next 4 years, I'm going to be involved with this economic crime symposium, and the person who runs it, his name is Barry Riders, my college advisor now, and I chose him actually because I knew his work through this, and we're really putting in a tax effect into it. And so when you treat something as an economic crime, it gets a lot more help from authorities around the world if you treated it as opposed to treating it as tax evasion. Because if you're treating it as tax avoidance and evasion, you're working on a moral cause, and you're also implicating the nation that's facilitating it. And so that's the sovereign question, that's the political economic question, and that's a lot harder to elect response and assistance from these nations. But as soon as you look at it as a crime, you get criminal enforcement agencies involved, and you actually get a lot more access than you would normally if you were to do it another way. Now, the proof of burden is still on the actual crime, and that makes it a lot harder, but it gives you access. And so that's, I think, a really important thing. So John is actually going to be taking part in this plenary that I'm organizing, and it's called the Criminalization of Tax Avoidance. And like I mentioned before, it'll be part of the story here, but I realized that being in a certain place really gave you access to things, and being a PhD student at Cambridge really gave me the opportunity to reach out to people who really wouldn't normally talk to me. So I actually use this event as a way to reach out to Jeff Cook in Jersey, so he's like the voice of the Jersey Islands, and I also reached out to Tim Ridley, and he's the voice of the Cayman Islands, to come talk to this event. And I showed them that John's name was on it, and they both declined respectfully. They're not going to be there. But it gave me an opportunity to reach out to them to say, look, do you want to have a conversation here about this in a public forum? So it really gives you a good chance to do this type of thing. So, but what it's also done is let me bring in people from HMRC and the OECD to talk about it as well. I thought that leading to the story is that, you know, I didn't think that this being at a particular school or being in a particular place would give you these opportunities. But I mean, within 6 weeks to 2 months of arriving at Cambridge, I was able to start my own tax discussion group, and we're a strong group of 30 now, and we're trying to compete globally against the Oxford Centre for Business Taxation. And we're doing quite well, actually, and I'm leading it, which is funny, because I'm probably the most radical of all of them. But I've started a website, easy to remember, tax.tax. And I'm inviting all of you guys to, if you ever pass through Cambridge, do come to one of our meetings. We meet once a week. It's very informal, and we use it as a place to invite people who might not normally come to Cambridge or who might be in the area for something else to come and talk to us. And it's really to talk about broadly tax-related issues. And we're a group of development studies students. We come from law, economics, we come from land economy. And so we come from a broad range of disciplines, and we talk to each other, and we might not normally talk to one another if we were on the street, because some of these people work for law firms who actively help companies evade taxes. And they're sitting in the same room with me, and we're talking to each other week by week, and I really get the opportunity to get into the mindset, into the values, and into how they construct their arguments, and how they actually go about on their day-to-day business, and you know, bringing these arguments to a global forum. And fortunately or unfortunately, some of these people are going to end up in you know, very high places to influence international public policies on tax matters. And so getting to know them now early in their careers will give me a better idea of, you know, how things might work 5 years from now when they graduate. So that's the story.
Many thanks. So a new round of questions. I have the first already here.
Hi, I have a question probably for Brad, although he's not present. Is relating to what offshore means for business education. Generally, it's a very big engine of education in the world. And by my understanding, offshore hardly features in it. And would love to know what it means for business education and how business education should change to be more realistic and to be more onshore.
So another question.
My question is for Jan, and I wonder how current is your data to show at the end. And the reason I'm asking is because there are some recent changes in law in foreign jurisdictions. So for example, the United States adopted FATCA just became effective 2 years ago. And you mentioned in response to a question that the Cayman Islands won't cooperate unless the United States asks, and the United States says to know something, and it can't know anything because of secrecy law. And that was indeed true under former exchange of information framework, but now Cayman and most other tax havens actually have intergovernmental agreements with the United States to implement FATCA. So I wonder if that data is still current, because I suspect that we will see some shift of assets from jurisdictions that are bound by FATCA to jurisdictions that are not.
Your last question over here.
This is for me. I was just wondering, like, on the sort of like ethnography point on the sort of young professionals, like, what do you think is the sort of way that these people kind of rationalise to themselves, like, what their career progression is going to be, like, towards working tax aid and that sort of stuff?
I can answer that quickly. I think Ronan was saying earlier, and it's really what they focus on in our tax discussion groups, is that right now they're really frustrated with the GAR, the General Anti-Avoidance Rules that are being implemented in the UK. And to them, there's a rule book, and they play by the rules, and that's all they focus on. They don't rationalize it any other way. And these are primarily lawyers that are in the group that are talking about this, and to them, it's about business efficiency and about following the rule of law, not about the spirit of the law, but the letter of the law. And that's really where they rationalize their behavior by sticking to the hard law.
How current is the data? In the two graphs, we use Orbis data. This is from September to 2015. It's quite recent. I would suspect that the Cayman Islands is the impact of FATCA is probably not as large as some other jurisdictions, because as I mentioned before, Cayman is not. I mean, there's probably some illicit money there, but they have their internal sovereignty, so they create their own laws, and they're kind of using their sovereignty to the maximum that's internationally acceptable. So it's not really illegal. So I think the amount of kind of black money is probably not that large. So I think some other jurisdictions would be probably more affected by this.
Okay. Well, thanks. It's interesting you mentioned GAR. I mean, GAR in the UK was predominantly, though they had a token presence of somebody from civil society, predominantly written by the corporate sector, and eventually creating a panel of business people with HMRC really has to consult before it can go after somebody said to be abusive. And then there are all kind of mitigating circumstances. Oh, well, this happened 10 years ago, but we redesigned the organization, so therefore you're out. So it is one of the most toothless pieces of law. So I think you mentioned GAR, my reading of that is that this is another example of the state profession nexus, where a lot of tax enforcement policy making has effectively been privatized. Hence, you can play these kind of onshore tax games, but you know the practical effect of that is nothing's really going to happen to you, because who's going to sit on this panel and say go after so-and-so abusive scheme, thereby establish a benchmark which will then come back and haunt them in the not too distant future. So I think if we really are looking for effective enforcement, we've got to break that particular nexus. And as they say, watch this space to see what happens within the next couple of years. Now, Atul raised a point about education. Well, I'm afraid I've been doing accounting education for a long time. Many other people have been involved in business education. I'm afraid it basically disables people. It does not really equip them to be good citizens, good human beings. Students come to university all concerned about tax avoidance, their granny getting a good pension, their mother getting a good treatment for cancer, their father breathing good air, neighbours having good roads, etc. built in. They come to the university, the business school, and all this is knocked out of them. And they go away thinking about shareholder wealth maximization, and companies are private and how we all got to be slaves to them. All this kind of concern about humanity is knocked out of them. And I see little prospect unless a lot of business academics are going to get together to change anything. I'll see little signs of any kind of emancipatory education coming along. We might pat ourselves at the back thinking, I'm teaching the ethics of module. Well, that's very well, teaching ethics for an hour, and then they go to the next class. By the way, the objective is to maximize shareholder wealth. Forget all that. If you want a job, this is what you've got to do. So I see nothing, to my mind, all the scandals that we are talking about, they begin at the university. The universities are complicit in all of this state of affairs that we are complaining about, and indeed that is where the change should begin. And universities are obviously not the only places of education. Family, home itself is. But nevertheless, university is a formal place of education. So what have accountants been doing? For years and years, they've developed not only offshore fire investment, Well, they had offshore balance, off balance sheet accounting. Simply, you could borrow things and they would vanish into thin air, never appear on the balance sheets. Nobody really has got any idea what your liabilities are. More people now go into financial engineering than in real engineering. KPMG has recruited more graduates this year than the entire UK chemical industry, just 1 firm. Okay, so that does not really give you much hope. 345,000 professionally qualified accountants in the UK, more than the rest of the EU put together, the highest per capita in the world. What exactly are they producing? Nothing. What does tax avoidance produce? Nothing. That's the part of the UK's productivity puzzle. Nobody looks at these people to see what are they producing. They're producing zilch. Okay, but they are rewarded extremely highly. So accountants obviously also have been the architects of this kind of a this kind of a neoliberal construction of the world, where a lot of things are moved offshore. They've been sitting on lots of committees writing tax laws, whether it is a patent box or the CFC, and indeed the former KPMG partner is the chairman of HMRC, and many others are present in various places. Very good people, I'm sure, but nevertheless one wonders what their past training has done to their mindset. So I see, to my mind, university education has failed. Most university graduates would come out, they would not have heard of the kind of things we are talking about. They would simply not. And if anybody is on professional education, even worse. There, the focus will be on learning the accounting rules, which with a defined FD would be completely redundant, and we are now in a position. Any kind of accounting problem, the first response from accountants is, who knows the answer? Is there a committee who can tell me officially what to do? They can't even think for themselves anymore, which suits the elites. That is exactly what they wanted. So I'm not very pessimistic about change. If the change is going to come, it is going to come from groups like this, exposing this, exerting pressure. That universities are not there just to train business people and accountants. They are there to produce good human beings, good citizens, so that we can all have good life. Life is too short. That is what we are, on this kind of a planet for. So one other thing, just coming back to the issue about Caymans. Now, it might be interesting to have some kind of oral histories, not only of the people who were instrumental in creating these havens, but also oral histories of people who might have protested at the time. If they are still alive, did they really think that this kind of a new political party called finance industry, highly dominant, what did they think about this? So again, if you look at a place like Jersey, what has happened? Your hotels have become offices, tourism isn't really economical, lots of your farms have become golf courses, traditional agriculture is no longer viable. So the world of finance has destroyed their traditional ways of earning a living. What are they to do? And if we want to take these people off this business, what do? Can we offer them grants? Can we offer them subsidies to develop something else? If so, who? What can we do? So I think oral histories of the protagonists involved earlier and even now, because the chances are those people who have not really benefited from these offshore places, their voices are not really being heard because of the lack of political institutions. So oral history can give voice to what is not heard, what is forgotten. It can bring to memory these kind of things. And if you're interested, I have written about how to do oral history. I'll be happy to refer you to some of those things.
Hey, would you like to?
Oh, actually, this is kind of one quick thing that I thought of. So through this economic crime conference in February, I learned about how criminal enforcement units have been quite frustrated with money laundering and dealing with proceeds of crime and prosecution. And so most financial intelligence units in the world have realized that they can't really prosecute as easily as they might have, because it costs a lot of money to put people in these protection programs and to go through that proof of burden. And so instead of prosecution, what they're doing now is they're shifting their gears into investing a lot more money into those national intelligence units, and they're also disrupting the business of crime. they're treating criminal organizations that do human trafficking, drug trafficking, and money laundering as a business. And rather than trying to stop them, because they're going to have, they realize that they'll have a great deal of difficulty stopping them, is to disrupt these businesses by introducing really heavy duties and really heavy regulatory burdens on them, and to really, I don't know if this is good or bad, but to bring that dirty money, the clean money, by taxing them, and that's a problem because it legitimates them and their money, and it brings them into society, and it only takes a part of that money. So that's what's happening now in the criminal enforcement side of economic crime.
Thanks for that question.
Anders Petersen, Natural Resource Governance Institute. I work on open data and perspective sector. Thanks a lot for the presentations. This was fantastic. I really like the website Tax. That's a great initiative. Really awesome. My question goes to Ian mainly regarding, you've already talked a bit about the data. I think many who are working with quantitative data in the community are seeing sort of two paths of doing investigations. Either you have access to corporate databases that you need to get access to pro bono. They have a black box methodology, so you don't, it's hard to check the provenance of the data. And then you have public data, which is often of very quality. My question would be mainly to BIS data, to ask you how useful this is getting, and where you see that going. And secondly, data such as SEC data, is that something that's useful enough, and how hard is it to work with it?
We can take two more now, anybody?
Thanks very much. I want to go through a question. I have a very simple question to what iPad is done, which is what is CATA? What is that?
Flat card problems.
The regulations of the cycling platform?
Yeah, flat card problems. Anybody else? A question? Or
すみません。日本から来ましたので、通訳の方から通訳してもらいます。今日はどうもありがとうございました。今日のその報告の中に、このフランクフルトの大学の方っていうそのスケジュールになっていて、もしかして違ってるのかもわからないんですけれど、労働ジャパンということ、日本で雇われるということが書いてあるので、それについて担当されてないのかもわからないですけど、何かコメントいただければと思います。
Well, I'm from Japan. My name is Kiyohito Wada. I have to, ask you to translate my Japanese. Thank you very much for today's presentation. On the program, there is, somebody from University Frankfurt, and was mentioned about the role of Japan. So if you have any comments on that, as a role of Japan, I would like to hear. Thank you.
Please, panelists respond.
So the FATCA is FATCA, and it's a U.S. imposed reporting requirement. FATCA. Yeah, if you Google it, there's an excessive.
It stands for Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act.
It's not fat cow. Private versus public data. Well, I think for us there's nothing comparable to the Orbis database, nothing really public data. We look at SEC data on voting behavior from funds, for example, but maybe we can speak about that very well. But I mean, in general, what I see is a big problem is there's with a lot of data and finance, you only get it by paying, especially on hedge funds. There was in I think 2009 the first attempt to collect any kind of data by a public or semi-public by the IOSCO data. Before there was absolutely no data available on the hedge fund industry, any official data. So I think it's a big problem. Actually, in the PDF program, I'm still listed as being from Frankfurt, and now the online program has been updated to Amsterdam. And also the title changed slightly. The role of Japan has been that it's surprisingly large in the Cayman Islands. And I think this is mostly due to this specific legislation by the Cayman Islands to attract Japanese investment and hedge funds. And about 1/10 of the Japanese assets have been invested back in Japan, and the rest has been invested in the US or the government.
Do you happen to know, just a little more detail on what this legislation did in order to attract the Japanese hedge funds? Would be interesting, just if you have anything.
Not really concrete.
Okay, see one more. This is the last round of questions, so everybody rush now.
Might be relevant. We have been talking about money laundering. In that, I read an interesting expression in an interview in Counterfact. It said the role of secrecy in suspicions is not so much money laundering, but earning laundering. Earnings laundering. I don't know if it makes sense.
I didn't quite catch.
No, I'm saying, for regard to the fact that it's or the laws that we're discussing, it was more about money laundering, but if we extend the meaning to say it is earnings laundering.
Okay.
It is an explanation maybe that captures the whole thing better than money laundering.
Apologies if this question has been asked already. I'm a latecomer, but I was just wondering if you have looked into the role of the financial regulators like the FCA. Obviously, all the hedge funds here in London are registered in the Cayman Islands. Is there any, do you think that Cameron now, with this summit coming up, should be more forceful and ask them to come onshore?
Okay, one last over here.
Christian, and one question for each one. About the coordinate, would you make that data available? Because it might be interesting to compare that to other factors than GDP, for instance, effective tax rates, or is it possible to look at social and environmental indicators to make a broader story about that? So, I'm interested in at what stage are you with the data set and how you might want to make it available to other organizations and researchers. And today, I'm really intrigued by the vocabulary of offshore. Christian, I try to talk increasingly with companies and investors to find what their language and what their understanding is of their own activities, and then trying to find splits within that community, because these are homogeneous or harmonious communities, which, as an outsider, we may think they are. There are people within them who may dissent, there are companies and investors who want to be on the side of change, on the progressive side, however they define that progressive at any point of time. And do you, maybe it's further down the research line, and it may not be apparent in the Cayman Islands sample, but like you talked about the indigenous and you talked about the bankers and Caymans, maybe some of the indigenous might be able to find alternative uses for their jurisdiction to become forced for better investment. And that kind of narrative is often the wider way out of the messaging.
Earnings laundering, I think it's really good because I think the Cayman Islands can be much better characterized as kind of a center for corporates. There's probably also some private money there and trust, to be sure, but mostly it's large financial institutions. It's U.S. banks that they've got it's called sweep accounts where they sweep money overnight to the Caymans, and hedge funds, some private equity. So I think it can be much better characterized as earnings laundering than money laundering. But I think Ireland, Bermuda, and Luxembourg probably played a large role in earnings laundering. Yeah, I think about 70% of the British or the hedge fund managed in Britain are domiciled in Caymans. But I think nobody will ever ask them to kind of come back, so to speak, because also some US hedge funds are domiciled in Delaware. I think about 20% of the global. But really, I think there is no such thing as a hedge fund in UK law, I think. As far as I'm concerned, they're mostly defined kind of negatively. So a mutual fund cannot do this and this and this, and the kind of what's left over, that's a hedge fund because they can do kind of all of it. Data availability, I think we have to also speak bilaterally. Like our results, of course, but we cannot kind of make the whole database available. I think.
Yeah. In terms of language, what I'll probably have to end up focusing on for my big PhD, because it's in sociology and it really looks at institutions and professions, is focus on the professional groups who are really vying for the business of elites. So if I separated it out by professional groups, by bankers, trustees, accountants, lawyers, you'll notice that they all use different languages and they all have complex languages in their individual professions, and they specialize in very highly technical language in offshore. So each forum has a different battleground. So it's a legal forum, it's a regulatory forum, it's a diplomatic forum. And so what we can't really look at is what goes on behind closed doors, but what we can look at in particular as anthropologists and sociologists is where tensions arise. And when you look at a financial crisis or when you look at a court judgment, you're only seeing a blip, maybe less than 1% of these tensions that are being battled out in public forums. But you see what matters to them the most by how they construct their arguments. And that's where we get a sense of things. And then what you do is you match that to long, lengthy, rich, detailed interviews. And then you use different types of interview approaches like life history methods, critical discourse analysis that comes from linguistics, and you use all these other packages of tools to really identify it. So there's no straight way of getting the answer, but going around it in circles and looking at this data for a long period of time. And I've been looking at this data for 5 years now. You do get a better sense of what they care about and what raises an eyebrow. And I thought it was funny because when I came here, I didn't really know a lot about UK culture, but being in certain groups in my school now, I know in what social groups it's appropriate to nod my head or shake my head when somebody mentions David Cameron.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks to the panelists for answering many good questions.
Again, one more minute of your time, please. The godfather of tax justice arrived. This is for you, Tom. We applauded you in your absence.
I've recorded the Godfather of tax justice. May you be shielded from legal spirits.
The guy who talks about the sociology of the market, because amazingly, until recently, market is out there, what's out there. And there's also a guy called John McKinsey, he's in Edinburgh, and he's written a lot of books about, a lot of papers as well, about the world of finance, how money moves around, not in a technical sense, but in a sociological sense. The new Frankenstein, F-L-I-G-S-T-E-I-N, and another guy, John McKinsey. And he's written papers with one of my former colleagues, Juval, excellent work on trying to explain what motivates people, what exactly are they constructing, what are they deconstructing, what are they destroying. Yeah, I find it very helpful. Well done. You were here.
A couple of things. One is, I'm a person who can help me with the my former colleague at work, I've tried to persuade him to come to the people. I'm only showing him. I mean, he's now retired. He worked in hedge funds. The other thing was to tell you that I'm coming I could maybe come to the I'm showing you I was just looking at the website, so Dominic is on it.
Yes, he started it, and he pushed me into
How did he come across you?
well, the Center for Tax Law has
They came from Deutschland.
It's run by just Dominic, not John Harris, Peter Harris. John Psychology gives
Is there a clicker? I think there's one available right now, which is a good
Ich möchte Sie darauf hinweisen, dass heute Morgen also es war jetzt heute Morgen.
Sagen Sie nochmal, wie lange ist Können Sie nochmal den zweiten?
Also das ist schon
Worte und
schon
I'm not sure.
in Deutschland gibt es aber Worte sind noch
We've got somebody from like the crime unit at HMRC.
So,
But what we're doing is we're basing it on Andrew Morris' paper on criminalization of offshore, and that's how I got him to come here. It's not a written paper, and I don't think I'm not sure if it's something I can discuss it, but I picked him because he's the voice of Cayman Finance, and I wanted to and so I'm getting all these PhD students to write 2,000 or 4,000 papers to us, and I'm very broad, but I wanted to do it.
You've got this paper.
Yeah, it's been published for a while. Yeah, it's he's the voice of Cayman Finance, which is their main publication. It's pro offshore, that's what it's.
No,
yeah.
Hi, my name is this report that you mentioned, is that on this tax tax?
No, so that's like a side project. That's just
Okay. So your report is
I got my master's.
Yeah. Yeah, okay. Well, this is my car. And you know, if you ever wanted, I mean, I would love to come to meetings. But then you can.
Yeah, you write about fairly broad topics.
Mostly so I've been doing a lot of finance. I started collapsing my this has been my focus ever since. European crisis, especially Cyprus and Ireland. So yeah, so that's basically I have Hi, are you?
Are you Sophie?
Yes.
Oh, great.
Are you?
I'm the facilitator.
Okay, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Do you have a presentation?
Yes, I do.
Would you like me to introduce you in some specific way? Just your name and where you're from and your university.
Yeah, you can say a couple of words as you want. I don't know how you tend to. Yeah.
I mean, Chris just said, just say my name and university, and then he will introduce himself.
Okay. Yeah.
Maybe I have to say that.
Yeah, I would love to see.
How do you pronounce it? Rennes University? Rennes?
Rennes. Yeah, Rennes. Yeah, really nice. You're staying on?
Yeah, I'll stay.
Are you coming tomorrow also?
So my first year PhD.
Okay, because I'm using it too. No. Yeah. I mean, Iceland. Yes, in UK.
And this is where this
I found it there. Where?
No.
Yeah, you guys should watch
We didn't send this everything last year.
Yes, yeah, I'm never the same. Weekend. Hoping that will be okay. I know, I lived in London for years, so I remember. I was a Yes, it's part of it is in English, but it's better that because then I can send you the slightly complicated there's part of it. And then from reading and seeing how the Icelandic ones operate, I got an insight into how other countries because Icelandic ones were not very sophisticated. These ones are a lot more sophisticated than basically. So that's one thing, but then with the Panama Papers, you just had more names of individuals, and so seeing the emails, you can really see the craft of how this is done, with whom they were operating. So it has expanded the knowledge of art. We knew about the business, but we didn't know about some of these actual names, which are some competitions. People would use the pension funds and related to politics. So it's huge. Yeah, so that would be great. And as I said, I mean, if you come to it's fantastic.
I'd be interested in tax avoidance. This is more of a academic-y, technical conference, but it's quite useful for you to meet other people working in tax administration.
Okay.
Okay. Now, so if you...
Oh, wow, this is interesting.
These are the topics.
Okay, so where will this be?
It'll be at University College London.
Okay, yeah, okay.
If you just go to jota.website.
Okay, write this down. Okay, well, thanks. Maybe I'll see you later. Yeah. See you, nice to meet you.
It's really more, it's just extremely who gets you need to they suppose that you
Oh, well. I just grab it.
and these are just how
And I put it on the website, so you'll see the schedule.
I mean, they have like some basic training for it.
Yeah, I went to
I can book it through I will be donating to
before my not my laptop slow. I tried to show you guys. Seconds.
We're going to get financial.
and then you have Virgin Mary as his cousin. So we're going to start with Sophie.
Sorry.
Do that.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to be here with you today and share ideas on corruption and tax havens. As you see, there are many logos. It's not that I'm fond of logos, but I'm a PhD student of the University of Rennes, so it's in Brittany. I'm also I'm doing my PhD in partnership with the National Center of Research in France and with an NGO called CHAPA, which is composed of lawyers and legal advisors, and we use laws to combat impunity and economic crimes. I wanted to start this presentation with the Panama Papers and the impact in France. I wanted to share with you the statement of the CEO of a French bank, a big bank. It's Société Générale. And so in 2012, in April 2012, in front of the Senate, the CEO of that bank said, "We have no more business, nor in great countries, nor in non-cooperative countries." So with the Panama Papers, this sentence takes another twist. The Panama Papers revealed that the bank has created hundreds of shell companies registered in Panama or in other tax havens. So in France, the public opinion was deeply moved by this exposure, which has led French authorities to call for a new audition and ask for accountability. The thing is, back in 2012, so when the hearing took place in front of the Senate, Panama was not on the list of non-cooperative countries of France, and it was also not on the list of the OECD. So when the CEO stated that it didn't have any activities in a non-cooperative country, that was right. Panama was not on the blacklist, on the French blacklist. This situation illustrates some economic actors' practices, which is playing with or abusing of the law. And this is the angle that I will take with my presentation today. First, let's see the scene and let's go back to the context. So as you know, we live in a globalized area that has led to the abolition of internal borders, the deregulation of financial markets, an increased ease of communication means, but also an interdependence and interconnection among actors. We've also realized that economic actors, notably multinational companies, corporations, have been playing a greater role in this global area. But globalization has had unforeseen impacts, such as weakening the role of states, but also the development of a gray area between legality and illegality, but also between licit and illicit. It has also enabled, globalization has also enabled actors to use and benefit from the different legal systems around the world, while regulations are still made at the national level rather than at the global level. So what's the outcome? Well, the outcome is that it has created opportunities for the development of new and innovative techniques to conceal corruption and particularly to use legal tools. Economic actors aim for those jurisdictions that they think are the best for their arrangement, that they consider the best for them. They maximize options available to them and creatively use and interpret the law. So basically, they get around the law and appear law-abiding. But they also contribute to the crafting and the design of legislation. And some authors have called this illegal business illegalism. So that is to say, the possibility for specific actors to use, manipulate, write the law in order to play with the boundaries of legality. And here, every sector is concerned by this business illegalism, and the extractive industry is no exception. So here, the extractive industry example. So we know that the extractive industry sector is really prone to corruption. This can be explained by the involvement of multiple actors, by its scale, but also by the amount of wealth that it generates. Corruption in the extractive sector happens to at every stage of the value chain. I hope you appreciate my home design of the value chain. So you have corruption. You can see corruption from the allocation phase to the negotiation of contracts, the procurement of goods and services, but also revenue collection and monitoring of operations. So basically, you can have corruption at any steps when you have an interaction with public officials. Well, they do that through the use of numerous mechanisms and systems, including tax haven, we mentioned it a lot today, secrecy jurisdiction, but also what I would call legal heavens, as in heavens, not heavens. I don't know how in English how you make the difference between the two. In all of these schemes, the main driver is the abuse of law. So how do you do the abuse of law? You do that by using existing legal tools. You take profit from loopholes in legislations. You also draft legislation in your own pockets. And you also divert legal requirements that are aimed to promote transparency or that are aimed to reduce corruptions. And so in the extractive industry sector, you have many examples of that. I don't want to bother you with many examples, so I've decided to focus this on two aspects: the use of existing legal tools and the way we divert legal requirements. The first example that I've chosen is the corporate vehicles. As you know, corporate entities or vehicles, such as shell companies, trusts, or foundations, are the most favored to conceal corruption. They are not illegal in themselves, they do not breach national laws, and for some it can be used it can have a legitimate purpose for managing real estate or for merger and acquisition. The thing is, it's the way you use it that matters. The way you use it make them illegitimate, divert them from their purpose. In the extractive industry sector, it can take various forms. You often encounter complex layers of corporate structure, shell companies to disguise illegal payments or to dilute corporate liability, individual liability. You have shell companies that are established to conceal the award of contracts to companies that are linked or connected to public officials or proxies of these public officials. Now we see that charity foundations or social projects are also used to channel corruption. And so in all of these cases, what we see is that we've only used legal corporate entities. And I want to give you a concrete example. So here I chose a case with Nigeria and France. So that's a case the case is closed now. It concerned the oil minister under Sani Abacha in Nigeria that opened a series of bank accounts in Switzerland under the name of his brother and under a false identity. He also opened a series of created a series of shell companies throughout the world. And in Paris, what he did, he created a Société Civile Immobilière, that is to say, a company managing real estate, to purchase goods under the name of the company. So this company was the owner of a mansion, a castle, a yacht, a speedboat, and various art objects and antiques. So the company was quite rich. The case revealed that, in fact, the money used through this Société Civile Immobilière was coming from proceeds of corruption from the award of licenses. A Société Civile Immobilière is a typical common corporate structure in France. Everyone can create one, and this is common when you have different apartments. You want to manage them, and you have tenants. I think that's the correct word in English. You have tenants, so you use this kind of company. But what we realize in France is that most of the time, this structure has been diverted to launder funds and purchase real estate through proceeds of corruption. So other cases, you can look at Congo, for example, or Equatorial Guinea. These are the type of the countries where they used Société Civile Immobilière to launder funds. Another case I wanted to share with you is about local context requirements. So in many resource-rich countries have introduced local context requirements within the national legal systems. Local context requirements aim to create jobs, but also to transfer skills and technologies at the national and local level. These rules take various forms, and they can take the form as an obligation toward a percentage of the procurement of goods and services to local companies, or an obligation for a company to enter into a joint venture with a local company. So although local content regulations were designed to promote and strengthen economic development, we have realized that they have been diverted and misused to perpetuate corruption, generate rent-seeking, and elite capture. We have different examples. We've seen cases where public officials are encouraged, not to say imposed, companies to partner with local companies. And those local companies were revealed to be shell companies owned by public officials or by their proxies. One case that is ongoing is Cobalt International Energy in Angola that you may have heard. So Cobalt International Energy is an oil company that got 2 oil blocks in Angola and partnered for these 2 oil blocks, partnered with 2 local companies. Those are Nazaki Oil and Gas and Upper Oil. A couple of months, a year later, suspicions of corruption arise. And so Cobalt had to provide information and started explaining that these companies had been assigned by the Angolan government. And so then the investigation that went on enabled to discover that Nazaki Oil and Gas was partly owned by another company named Aquatro. That is a company linked to Angolan officials. So under local context requirements, we see that it profits to public officials. And we also see that the Alper Oils, the other local company, the owners remain so far undisclosed. So the case is currently under investigation in the US with the Department of Justice. Another example here is transparent bidding processes and how these processes have been abused. So in the extractive industry sector, you know, it's opaque, you have a lot of secrecy, and so we've tried to introduce bidding processes to ensure competition, but also transparency, promoting transparency, with the objective to reduce corruption and risk of collusion. Unfortunately, these bidding processes have been also misused to continue and perpetuate corruption. A classic example is when you have the criteria of the bidding process that were designed to match a specific company, and then when you look at this company, in fact, the company is linked to public officials. Or when you have a consortium of a partner, a joint venture, a consortium of companies that bid to that process, and within this consortium, you have one company again linked to the government. To be more concrete, we have also an ongoing case. It's Kinross Gold Corporation. This time it's in Mauritania. Kinross Gold Corporation is a Canadian mining company. It's also under investigation by the US Security Exchange Commission. And here, this case was made possible through information brought by a whistleblower. And so among the numbers of documents that this whistleblower brought to the attention of the authorities, it was revealed that in 2013, Kinross Gold Corporation had launched a bidding process to provide services related to logistics within its mine in Mauritania. And so a local company called Morilog applied and won the bidding process, but it has undisclosed beneficial owner. Its offer was at a higher price than its competitor, and it didn't have expertise in the field. So you may wonder, why did it win the bid? And so the investigation and the information brought by the whistleblower led us to realize that in fact Morilog, so the local company, was linked to the president of Mauritania. So here I could give you more and more examples, and we could look at regulations, we could look at the fourth anti-money laundering legislation, we could look at the UN Convention Against Corruption, we could look at so many instruments and see how you can divert those instruments to conceal corruption. I wanted to share with you a statement that I think is indicative of the situation. This was pronounced by an oil company, a French oil company, in front of the Senate. It's easy to know which one. So this company, over suspicions of corruption and tax evasion, stated, "What we did was not illegal vis-à-vis the national system. It was in compliance with the law." And I found this statement really interesting. For me, that sums up the whole situation we have here. So what does it tell us? Well, to sum up, yes, I do agree that tax haven plays a role in hiding proceeds of corruption, but I think we should look at the way law is interpreted, analyzed, and I think this is a main issue to consider. With those examples, I wanted to show you that every legal provision can be diverted, can be used as a tool to conceal corruption. I also wanted to highlight the fact that actors adapt quickly to legal reforms. They are like a step ahead of us, and they change jurisdictions accordingly. Just to give an example, you can't use intermediaries, that's fine, then change it to a commercial agent and continue business as usual. So here I have maybe a provocative question, which is it the role of law to regulate, anticipate, and foresee or respond to all frauds? And the second question will be, what about law enforcement? I think today we haven't really talked about law enforcement, and it would be great to hear your views on that. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Sophie. And now Chris Jones. Yep.
Yes.
That was one.
How about if I speak with a loud voice? Can people hear me at the back? Yeah, if I speak like that, okay. We won't bother with that. Okay, I'm a little bit like the second presenter. I'm used to walking around. So my name's Chris Jones. I am a senior lecturer in economics from Aston Business School. This is a paper with my colleague Yamata Mori, who is sitting just there, and with Alex as well. The title of our paper is called Tax Haven Networks and the Role of the Big Four Accountancy Firms. Just to note, this is a work in progress. Our results are preliminary. We're still working on them. I think they have generated a bit of interest so far. Hopefully they'll have a little bit of impact. I don't know, we'll see. Okay, so I think with any research paper, it's really important to state really clearly the research question and the motivation. So the focus of this paper is about investigating the extent, and notice I've underlined the word, the two words extent, to which tax haven networks are utilised by multinational enterprises by identifying essentially a set of firm and country level factors that drive this activity. And more specifically, we're going to look at the role of the Big Four accountancy firms in relation to tax avoidance. Now, this is the second time I presented this paper. The last time I presented it was a couple of weeks ago to the community that looks at international business, okay, the discipline of international business. And these are in the past, these are conferences I go to, okay, conferences in international business, and quite surprisingly, they don't tend to talk much about tax, which is slightly bizarre given the use of tax havens seems to be so pervasive by firms who engage in international business. My presentation quite economicsy in a sense, okay? So there's going to be some stats here. So I'm conscious of the fact that I'm the last presenter today, so I will try my best to make the dismal science interesting. But I'm also conscious of the fact that there are lots of people from different disciplines here. Okay, so criminology, heard from quite a lot of criminologists. I guess there's political scientists, accountants, finance. I don't know how many economists are here. Okay, so I'll try my best to bring this to life. And I guess a couple of weeks ago when I presented this paper, I guess I had to put it into context in front of a bunch of people who perhaps don't know too much about this. Okay, clearly this audience is different. Okay, most of you who are in the audience and watching, perhaps on the podcast or whatever you want to call it, know something about this. So I'm not going to talk too much about all these things that we know stuff about. But as an economist, I guess the thing that interests me is that sort of fifth bullet point. It's the sort of inequality context. Okay, Piketty wrote an interesting book, which he had quite a controversial name for that book. And I think what's quite interesting is the share of capital in GDP is growing quite enormously. And perhaps the use of tax havens is partly responsible for that change in that growing share. Okay, it's also set within the context of this race to the bottom, which you're all familiar with. The Chancellor has decided to cut the corporate tax rate to 17%. At the same time as saying we're going to do stuff about tax avoidance, and we've also got this patent box regime as well, which I think they've extended these to many countries abroad. Let me just grab it. Okay, so that's the context, and then obviously we've got this LuxLeaks scandal, which sort of shows the role of the Big Four, basically in all of it. Okay, last point, just to jump back to a statement I said slightly earlier in this slide. I guess what we're trying to do is we're going to show some evidence of correlation with Big Four in terms of tax avoidance, but we're also going to hint, more importantly, at some causality as well. Okay, and this is something that we are currently working on in a bit more detail behind the scenes. Okay, with any academic paper, and we're targeting this a management journal, or an IB journal, there's got to be some theory. Okay, so our theory extends a paper that we've just published in the Journal of World Business, Jones and Tamori, 2016, that specifically looks at the determinants of what we call tax haven FDI, whereas this is about the extent to which M&Es do this type of thing. And we had to use some theory in order for us to generate some testable hypotheses. So there's a few theories that I've put up there. I don't know how familiar you are with them, but common theory in international business is this idea of internalization theory. Okay, clearly internalization is going to be important if you want to use tax havens, because you want to keep this in-house. Okay, so we utilize that, and you can see that in the paper if you wish to have a read of the paper. Furthermore, we also use some stuff on the varieties of capitalism literature, which comes out of political science. So the basic idea on this is that the variety of capitalism has some impact on the amount of activity firms do this. Okay, so firms from liberal market countries like the UK, the US, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, may do this to a greater propensity from those firms from coordinated market economies like Germany, Austria, Japan and the Nordics. Now that doesn't mean to say I'm saying that firms from those countries don't do that. Clearly they do, right? But it's in terms of degree. Okay, so we can talk a little bit about that in this paper. And also I found a fairly small literature that looks about the relationship between the auditing of accounts and the fact that these accountancy firms also offer tax advice. I think I went on one of these firms' websites the other day, it might be PwC, and you look at the services they offer, and the first one says audit, and the second one says tax. Okay, quite intriguing. And then obviously Prem's written a load of papers about the Big Four, so we'll be utilising some of his literature as well. This diagram here is a sort of theoretical contribution. The idea is that a mix of firm-specific advantage and country-specific advantage, as well as a regulatory environment, and maybe a whole industry will grow up sort of that aids this tax avoidance activity of firms. Okay. So these are the testable hypotheses, and maybe you just want to have a little bit of an eyeball and a little read of these. So this is what I'm going to test with bad data. So the first one is that the extent of a MNE's tax haven network depends positively on the value of its intangible assets relative to total assets. So the idea is that MNEs are going to locate patents, trademarks, whatever, in these tax havens, you know, to aid royalty flows flowing into them, so they can avoid tax at home and abroad. Okay, so that's the first one. That's been addressed in the literature before. The second one is that MNEs audited by the Big Four accountancy firms will utilise tax haven subsidiaries to a greater extent compared to MNEs who don't use them to file their accounts. And then the final one is about the varieties of capitalism. So MNEs incorporated in liberal market economies will utilise tax haven subsidies to a greater extent compared to MNEs from coordinated market economies. Perhaps today you guys may be more interested in hypothesis 2. Okay, so the way we analyse, or the way we test these hypotheses is using an econometric model. Okay, I don't think everybody in here is familiar with this type of statistics, right? But just go with me, basically. So we have a dependent variable there, which is going to be the number of tax haven subsidiaries, and we're going to regress that on a number of control variables, one of which is a Big Four dummy. Okay, now the model we're going to use is called a count model. It's called a random effects negative binomial model. Okay, this is panel data, so we have variation across firms and time, and we also lag our variables, sort of control for what's called endogeneity, and sort of address the causality issue. Now, it's important to note that our sample at the moment is only going to include firms who utilise tax havens. We may address this because of various statistical reasons. Okay, so the dependent variable is the number of tax haven subsidiaries. IATA stands for intangible assets to total assets. That tests our first hypothesis. The VOC is a dummy variable that is testing our third hypothesis, and then we've got the Big Four dummy, which tests the auditor hypothesis. And then we've got a vector of standard characteristics that you would expect to impact on firms doing this. So the size of firms, the age of firms, and the level of internationalisation, the number of non-tax haven subsidiaries. Okay, what data do we use? So this work builds on the paper we published earlier in the year. Someone's already mentioned Orbis earlier. Okay, we've been working with this for quite a while now. So we're using this Orbis data. This is firm level data provided by Bureau van Dijk. It's a private data set that you have to purchase. We utilise data from 12 OECD countries between 2005 to 2013. We have various selection criteria to determine which firms we're going to use. Okay, first selection criteria, each firm must have at least one tax haven subsidiary, because we're looking at the extent. Okay, and we choose firms that have a greater number than 5 employees. Yama, do you want to just say?
What we wanted to do is not consider firms which might be considered shell companies, having one employee and a name attached to a company with, I don't know, hundreds of millions of assets. But most of the firms will be on the larger side, so you wouldn't have that many firms with less than 50 minutes. But we wanted to keep that lower threshold.
Okay, so we have about 5,912 multinational companies in the data set. 3,259 are from our liberal market economies. Just over 2,500 are from the coordinated market economy. So this means our data set is pretty big, nearly 25,000 observations. Orbis is very useful because it tells us the auditor that the MNE utilises. Our definition of tax haven, so I guess in many ways this in the past has been more of an art as opposed to a science. There's plenty of lists available, one of which is in your book that we looked at, and there's been papers published in the Journal of Public Economics by Hines and Rice that we've utilised in the past. But we try and make it a little bit more scientific by using the Financial Secrecy Index. And for the 2013 Financial Secrecy Index, there's sort of this natural cut-off for the secrecy score component of 65. So what we do is we get our M&Es and we look at the location of their subsidiaries, and if those subsidiaries, where they're located, the country has a secrecy score greater than 65, then we classify that as a tax haven subsidiary. Okay, I'm not that familiar whether anybody has done that before. Okay, it's not a perfect dependent variable by any stretch of the imagination. Okay, we'd really love to have total assets in these subsidiaries, but we don't have that. Okay. Okay, so this is almost the best we can do at the moment. Okay, there's quite a lot of stuff going on in those descriptive statistics. So I'll summarize it very quickly. We have quite an even distribution of M&Es across the countries included, and they're quite evenly distributed from the primary manufacturing and services sector. Perhaps when we come to submitting this paper to the journal, we might have descriptive statistics in greater detail. So we could look at firms from digital industries and so on. Okay, so I guess this was our first stab at descriptive stats. It's informative, but maybe we can improve it. These are the descriptive statistics from the data set. Okay, what might interest you here is that on average, each M&E has approximately 5 to 6 tax haven subsidiaries. That's what we find in our data set. And 55% of our firm year observations come from liberal market economies, 45% from the coordinated. And out of all of our firms, 66% are audited by the Big Four. And that breaks down 17% for PwC, 18% for Ernst & Young, 17% for KPMG, and 13% for Deloitte. And once we've got that auditor data, we can then play around with it a little bit. So what we find is 57% of our firm year observations, firms have always been audited by a Big Four. Okay, about 26% of our observations, they haven't been audited by a Big Four. Only 5% drop the Big Four. They're quite interesting. Maybe they're worth a look why they decide to drop. And then the last one, this is more interesting, about 10% take on a Big Four at some point during our sample. And that variation allows us to generate some interesting results. Okay, so I do have a number of slides that show the results. So tables with numbers flying around. I don't think I want to ram those down your throat at 20 to 5, so I won't do that. I'll just briefly summarize what we find. So first thing, the coefficients that we generate should be interpreted as incidence rates. We find good support for our 3 hypotheses. Our key finding is that of those M&Es that utilise a Big Four auditor, the tax haven incidence is 10 to 12% higher compared to those M&Es who do not use them. That's quite an interesting result. We find variation across the Big Four. PwC generates the highest incidence rate. That's sort of consistent with what happened with LuxLeaks. Okay, in terms of market orientation, okay, the size of firms' tax haven network seems to be a lot bigger for those firms who are from liberal market economies, and perhaps that's not surprising in a sense. Okay, British M&Es, you know, we've had a lot of debate today whether the UK is a tax haven or not. Okay, perhaps it's not surprising. Maybe there's an economic geography story to our findings there. I think we state that in our previous paper. I guess the causality thing, which I mentioned earlier, is that what we find is the growth rate of tax haven subsidiaries is 2.9 times higher for M&Es that take on a Big Four auditor. Okay, so it's quite intriguing. You take on a Big Four auditor, it seems like you're 2.9 times higher to utilise tax haven. Okay, so this is perhaps one of our key findings because it's sort of hinting at causality. Okay, so I've got quite a few regression tables there. If anybody wants to look at these after, feel free to look. But I'll come to the discussion. So, just to summarise, what do? We find that firm-specific and country-specific factors drive the extent to which MNEs utilise tax havens. And we find that high-tech firms from liberal market that are liberal marketly orientated have a greater incidence rate. Utilising a big four to sign off the accounts clearly has an impact. So perhaps policymakers maybe need to look into this, should further scrutinise the role of the big four in terms of tax avoidance. Now, I guess one weakness with our paper is that we're focusing on auditors. What we'd really like to know is whether these firms are using these firms as tax consultants. But that data is very difficult to get. I don't know where that would appear in the balance sheet. So maybe that's another potential policy impact. Maybe there should be greater transparency shown to show what a firm's doing. Are they using the same auditor for tax advice? I think Sarbanes-Oxley in the United States goes some way towards that, but I don't think it has too much impact. It's not really tightly regulated. Okay, that's it. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you for those papers. I'm Richard Murphy. For those who don't know me, slightly to my own surprise, I'm a professor at this university. I was appointed last September. I call it my late career change, because certainly I'm a professor in practice of international political economy, which actually says I haven't got a PhD. It's the subtle communication method of the world of academia. Sorry? Thank you, Apple. You know who appointed me. Thank you for these two papers. It is late in the afternoon. I'm not as kind as you are to my students, I have to say. 25, I quite happily throw some nasty stuff at them, but you obviously don't feel like doing so. I want to make a few comments, just highlighting some of the issues which I think the papers bring to our attention. Sophie, some of that material, I admit to me, was relatively familiar, and I hope you will talk to Robert Palmer. If you don't know Robert, a global witness, who has been in this area for a long time as well, and there's clear commonality between what you're doing and some of that material. And it's good to see the research on the extractive industries is continuing, though. It would be very easy for that to disappear. But you asked some very interesting questions right at the end, which I thought were really good, which is about the duty to comply with the law and law enforcement. And I think that's an area which has been under-researched. And Sophie is a feature of some of the research applications and funding applications which I'm looking at the moment, which is, it's all very well right now in the world getting new laws, for example, on beneficial ownership or automatic information exchange or anything else, country by country reporting. All those things we advance for. But what happens if nobody does anything with the data when it is exchanged, supplied, or whatever else? My big fear is that actually that's going to happen in tax, and I think it's happening with regards to law. The example I will use is the UK Register of Beneficial Ownership. This supposed move which is going to put the UK at the forefront of the attack on abuse. No new resources are being supplied to the UK's Companies House to actually regulate this or investigate abuse. The disclosure is therefore entirely voluntary. There is no expectation of new prosecutions. There hasn't been a prosecution of a single company in Scotland for abuse of Scottish company law since 2008, which is very relevant in the context of the debate we have tomorrow on the use of limited partnerships in Scotland. The resources aren't being supplied to actually regulate and impose this law. It is mere paperwork. And I think as a line of direction of travel, the amount of resource being dedicated to the actual implementation of the measures that we've been calling for, which were being now promised by regulators and politicians, is an important area for research. So I encourage you to actually ask more questions about how much is going on there. I'm going to move on rapidly because it so happens I'm heavily involved with research on the Big Four at the moment. I won't be here tomorrow because I'm meeting Chris Sanger, who is the global head of tax at Ernst & Young, at his invitation, because I'm doing some research on the Big Four right now, joined between City and Copenhagen Business School. And I think that there are a number of things about your paper that I like a lot. I question some of the causality links, and I think the Big Four have got away with a great deal. I should confess, I was trained by KPMG a very long time ago. I left in 1983. They told me that if I kept my nose clean for 10 years, they would make me a partner. I decided that was an invitation to leave. I knew full well that I would never keep my nose clean for 10 years. So I left. Another person who also trained at KPMG, Atul Shah over here, has been doing some great work on. You're guilty too. And you'll be doing some great research on what they're up to as well. And these firms need to be researched in more depth. I'm quite sure of that, because their structure, their whole mentality actually fits to some extent in what you were talking about, Sophie. This constructive non-compliance, if I can quote an idea which Atul created, they will appear to be compliant and actually they won't be. Exactly the same as your bank in the opening introductory comment. We don't use tax havens. Well, Panama wasn't on the list at the time, therefore we can apparently say it, even though it's not true. It's a feature of what they're doing. If I look at your data, basically if you're going to use tax haven, you may have no choice but use the Big Four. You might be looking at causality that being with the Big Four puts you into a tax haven category, but it may be the other way around. Because the Big Four are the only people who have a network of tax haven auditing firms. A company hates to take any part of its audit outside its own audit network. My argument is that without the Big Four being present in almost every tax haven, all four of them are in the British Virgin Islands. Total population, 28,000 people. Just to give an example, there's an island, for those who are not familiar with UK geography, off the south coast of England called the Isle of Wight. It has a population 5 times that of the British Virgin Islands. Mysteriously, not a single Big Four firm of accountants is present. How strange is that? Well, mainly down to offshore. Now, of course, offshore is all about servicing a community who are not there. That's the point about offshore. The users are elsewhere. And I think that if you look at the Big Four and you look at the next tier of firms that are BDOs and Grant Thorntons and all those, next to it, RSM, none of them have the spread. So if you are a firm that wants to use tax havens, you will go to the Big Four. If you are, I was also interested in your hypothesis on intangible versus total assets. Because actually intangible assets could be created to let you use a tax haven. They aren't proof of why you go to a tax haven. Again, you might generate it. So I'm just posing some awkward questions here about which way around that causality runs, as I think I should do. Interesting as well the number of the ratio of in your sample, because you came up with almost equal numbers of representatives of each of the Big Four firms. 17%, 18%, 17 or something, and then slightly lower for Deloitte. Whereas actually, PwC are way out, and Deloitte are way bigger than Ernst & Young and KPMG. And the ratio is PwC and Deloitte are much bigger than the other two. Then it's Ernst & Young, and then it's KPMG. KPMG are falling steadily down the tables. Maybe it's because Atul and I left. They didn't know what they were doing all those years ago in both their cases. But the fact that they ended up as almost equal sample sizes, but PwC came out as the biggest user of tax havens, well, I think that might indicate the fact that they actually just simply audit more of the world's biggest companies, who may be there in more time. Something that I would be very interested in, which actually I'm involved in doing some research for with just one grant at City to look at, how has that structuring changed over time? So we're going to do a sample looking at that structuring over time, 15-year time span. How have the 20 large companies changed their structure over time, see if that has had an impact. We saw with Mossack Fonseca from 2009 onwards, the number of offshore subsidiaries that they've been creating has gone down in proportion to the number they've got rid of. So in fact, they now get rid of twice as many offshore companies as they create. Are we seeing the same in the corporate world? I am told by finance directors that that is what is happening at the moment. One of my other posts is that I'm the tax advisor to the local authority pension fund forum. It's a useful position to have because they have £180 billion under management. So if I want to go and ask the big firms some questions, I can just say, I've got £180 billion behind that question. And they tend to therefore say yes to the interview. Because 180 billion opens doors in their world. And one of the questions I've been asking large firms this year, and I have been asking a number of finance directors, what are you doing about offshore? And they're all saying, we are tidying up our portfolios as fast as we can. And the report that they were all petrified of was the ActionAid 2011 report, which looked at the FTSE 100 and how many offshore subsidiaries they had. And they are petrified that somebody's going to repeat it. Please, volunteers, as soon as possible, because they don't want to be called out in the same way again. So actually, note that the NGO activity works, it does. This one really hit home, apparently. It's the one that's told me time and again, that's the one that hurt them. And they are cleaning up their act. One of them said that in 2011 it had 130 odd, and its target is within 18 months to have no more than 10 offshore subsidiaries. The cost of getting rid of those 10 will be too high, but at that point they're willing to explain what's left. So we're seeing a change in behaviour as well, I think. So I think one of my concerns, your data, the panel data needs to extend as close to the present as possible to see what the trend over time might be. Anyway, those are the points I saw in the papers. I hope my comments are reviewed. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. And now, I don't know if some of you at Chris want to address any of Richard's comments, otherwise we'll just open the floor for questions.
Well, I guess I can say about the causality. That's the thing, you're always going to struggle with this. We've spoken to a few people, and they just like the idea if there's some statistical correlation analysis to a certain degree.
Oh, I think that's great.
And I don't think there is anything on that. So I think part of, you know.
Oh, as the literature, let's be clear about it. It's an important contribution, I think, to this paper. But I think there's the discussion is
especially targeting to these management ID journals. There's just dearth of research. So that's, I guess that's whether we can overcome the causality. I think some of the other specifications do go part of the way, but maybe this is quite a hot topic at the moment. Do you keep it where it is now and submit to a journal, or do you wait a little bit and maybe make your analysis really watertight, or do you just write another paper?
Where are you on the ref?
I'm all right.
Okay, wait. So that's an academic in general, for those who aren't familiar.
I couldn't agree more with what you said about law enforcement. We see, like with compliance program within the companies, it's just a matter of ticking boxes. It's the same with banks. We see it even with the current EU directive on Transparency and Accountability Directive. We also have flaws within the definition of categories of payments and how companies use with that to hide the different payments. You have so many issues, and like in France, we've been caught by OECD and other international organizations but corruption, apparently we don't do enough. And it's basically because we don't allocate enough resources to the prosecutor, to investigating judges, to the police to do their job and really look into the cases. So I totally agree with that. We look also into cases of what we call differential treatment of companies versus multinational companies versus individuals, and the way that when they're caught up with issues of tax evasion or corruption, they get settlements and then go to trial. They just settle with the administration or with the prosecutor. So these are also elements that I look at how we've had a system that tends to defend those that go around the law.
Okay, great. Now we'll open the floor for questions. We'll take 3 first questions.
First question, we don't know. We don't know. We can only count the numbers of offshore companies. We don't know the size of the volume, we don't know the assets. So, when speaking of tidying up, how do we know that those firms are not just consolidating their assets in fewer companies? And in that sense, didn't we fit our own purpose? Because now it's actually, it looks better, but it's not better.
Robert Palmer from Global Witness. I'm really interested in this question about how you change behaviour of professional enablers or professionals involved in this system. Because in many ways we have bodies of law that are in place that means that professional enablers are not in theory allowed to enable money laundering or corruption or in some countries tax evasion. And yet they very much find ways of looking the other way or not asking questions. So I wonder what we do as a community to try and shift that balance and that focus within the community. Like, what are the levers that we can put on, especially in an economic time where money for enforcement is just not going to materialise?
Okay, we'll take 1 more question. So I'll have Mrs. Hannah, and then we'll do another round.
So,
please introduce yourself and just where you come from.
I mean, my point was in a way to pick up from what Richard was saying about the direction in which things are going. And I totally agree with you. That's right, that the companies are trying to tidy up their structures, partly because of the transparency push, and partly because of country-by-country reporting. And so I think we need to think about where we're going. And the analysis that TJN came up with a while ago, I remember the debate between you and it was me about offshore. And we insisted, I think absolutely right, we were probably the men pushing it, but it's a system. So that the targets were not just Cayman Islands or Whidbey Island, but we need to look at the interaction between London and Cayman Islands. And I think that the effect of the changes since then is really to make that more and more complex set of relationships. In the transparency area, now that we've got British government is saying that they're going to extend some transparency to British overseas territories and so on, obviously raises the question, what about US states? So this kind of restructuring, I think, is going to make that a bit more complex, because a lot of the papers today are focused on what's happening in the Cayman Islands, when we always emphasise it's the relation between what happens in the Cayman Islands and in the UK. And I think that relationship is going to become more complex. They may well do a lot more than they used to do in the Cayman Islands, in Arizona, Nevada, or wherever, somewhere else. So I think we have to see the direction in which things are going. And that leads to the question, I mean, I agree that these kinds of quantitative papers are very helpful. But in a way, you get out what you put in. So the numbers you get out of apparent correlations and on the initial conceptualizations. And the initial conceptualization can be quite complex and difficult to refine to the point where you can get sensible data around.
Yeah, okay, so the data reliability, I guess we just do the best we can, in a sense, because the data is quite messy. There is a limited academic literature that looks in this issue, and I guess the more we can do, the more stories we can tell, it sort of opens it up to future research. So maybe that addresses kind of Robert's point in a sense. But I guess, what we could do basically.
One area you could do, which is only true I think of UK companies, is actually the split between audit fees and tax fees is in the notes to the accounts, but is not picked up in things like audits, because they don't do an analysis of the notes. So you have to go back and look at the real accounts. I mean, I know that's really quite daunting. Who wants to read a set of accounts? I do. Who else does? Nobody. That I can work out. But yeah, there is that possibility. But actually, you're right. A lot of the data is very messy, and reliance on databases does itself create problems. I think the point you made about, are we just hitting a false target by cutting the number of subsidiaries is interesting. It isn't interesting, because yes, they may just be consolidating in fewer companies. That's not been the pattern of behaviour in the past. If anything, the pattern of behaviour in the past has been the exact opposite, and the whole reason to do it has been to diversify liability risk. I mean, that's why large companies have created so many subsidiaries. The more limited companies there are in the system, the more likely it is they can ring-fence liability inside a subsidiary somewhere, which doesn't leave an impact on the rest. I did have a discussion with somebody who Sol knows well, who is a tax director in a group with about 8,000 subsidiaries. There aren't many with 8,000 subsidiaries. And I said, why have you kept most of those? In fact, the company is no longer got 8,000 because the company's been split up, which would give an even better clue as to what's going on. He said, well, we can't get rid of them because we don't know why they existed. Because the corporate knowledge of the history has disappeared. So there might be a risk, but they don't know what it is. And therefore they can't get rid of it in case that appears later on. So some companies, that's clearly the case. One of the companies I interviewed this year had that problem. They didn't know why a whole chunk of their offshore subsidiaries really existed. Because nobody who was around when they were created was now with the company. The documentation wasn't really good enough to explain what they'd done. So there is that factor. But I do think you're right. I think there will be an attempt to reduce. It's rather like country by country reporting. Do you know what? When we finally get it on public record, it will not show as much offshore activity as we ever thought existed. Why? Because we've given them a long enough lead time, which is, I think, what they're trying to create by fighting at the moment, to get rid of most of it before it goes on public record. And then they'll say, what were you making a fuss about? Well, actually, because we cleared it up by having the pressure to create it. And that's why I think at the moment, I'm sort of documenting this stuff, even if I can only publish it anonymously eventually, to have the track record that this is a process going on.
Maybe to regarding your question, I think your question is really relevant. I'm hoping to have basic ideas at the end of my PhD, hoping. But I think your question leads to another question: what kind of society do we want? And this, this is a huge topic. Yeah, I know. But that what matters, and we should maybe go back to education. And earlier we mentioned about Cambridge students, and I can talk about my fellow colleagues from law faculties. And I have a degree in international business law, so I could have been doing that. And when I discuss with my friends, they don't see the implication behind what they do, so we often fight. And I think maybe we should start with the way we teach, and sensitizing, but also like to give you a more short-term example. What I do as a legal advisor at Sherpa, we do litigation, so we use the same tools, the same legal tools as companies, to try to have the balance. I can't find the word in English, but to have the balance. And so if they use certain tools, then we use others. Like we will use money laundering offenses, we would go for others. And so we have had cases ongoing in France, because we try to use the same legal tools as companies to try to change things and then bring attention to the public opinion. And we see with the Panama Papers, that has LuxLeaks, Swiss Leaks, and all the leaks. This has brought attention to all the bad practices, the wrong practices, and the public opinion is aware of it. And I thought here in the UK it's very important, because this morning I was in the hotel and I told the reception, the woman asked me where I was going, so I said I'm going to attend a workshop on corruption and tax havens, and she was like, okay, when you come back, you have to tell me about it, because tax haven has bad. I pay my taxes, and multinational corporations don't. And so I thought that was fantastic, because this is the kind of things I don't have in France. And I thought, that's great, there's awareness about it. That's, for me, that's the first step. That's maybe not nothing, but I'm still having hopes.
Okay, we'll take 3 more questions. We had 2 already there.
Yeah, my name is Sigrid journalist. I want to come back to what you were mentioning, Richard, about the mindset, which is really, really important. Because there is only so much that we seem to be able to do with law and legislation when there is this sincere, deep and profound will to find the way around it. And there is one sector, for example, which I know fairly well, which is the startup sector, for example, in Silicon Valley, where you start with young kids who come in with great ideas, and some of them succeed. Now, as soon as they succeed, they're approached by who? By lawyers, by accountants who specialize in this. And I mean, this is, and I'm not using this this parallel lightly. I mean, these people are like vampires in the sense that they bite, and once they have bitten, the person is sort of smitten. And this is so truly, truly sad to see, because obviously these young kids, they're obviously flattered by being approached by these people, and they feel that this is the way of doing it, and this is the way to do it, and this is the way everybody does it. So it's profoundly sad to see this invasion. And coming back to the mindset, it's so important. I remember, I often think about my late father, who decades ago said to me, "Cyril, it's good to pay high tax, because it means that you are earning well." Now it seems, if you're paying high tax, it's a show of you being dumb and really out of it. That's sad.
Yes,
I'd like to ask a question to both Chris and Richard about actually the race to the bottom and the patent box. Because I'm not quite sure what the state of affairs is now with regards to the patent box. I understand that Mr. Osborne has been told by the Germans that this is not really on. And so I was just wondering where we stand with regards to this legislation. My second question regards Northern Ireland. I understand that Northern Ireland is allowed to have a new corporate tax of 12.5%, which raises interesting questions, I guess, because what about the rest of the UK?
Thomas Faccio, Business School. My question was around the usage of the Big Four, and I was wondering how you take into account the fact that although one company might be audited by Big Four, tax consultancy work would come from another Big Four. And also, over the years, there are mergers. If one power, one division, one group could be a structure that was where the tax consultancy work was provided by one auditor, and although they will be acquired by somebody else that does the audit, they will still use the tax consultant from that division. So I don't know whether that shows in your data.
Can I comment on that now?
We've had 3 questions, is that
we were asked to wrap up soon briefly, so we'll take one more question. I think that will be the last one. Well, the last 2, I guess. Just very brief answer.
Thank you, Chris and Sophie, for the presentation. Thank you, Richard. I have a question for you, Chris, and also for you, Richard. Coming from before, I'm also a former KPMG employee, so welcome. Well, so the first question I think is just to follow up on what you just asked. My understanding is that because I worked in Luxembourg, which I think I should have mentioned, too, makes a difference. But after Sarbanes-Oxley, obviously it was very difficult for some accounting firm to provide both services, taxation and audit, right? But what happened in Luxembourg, which I think is likely to have been the case in smaller jurisdictions, is that although KPMG wouldn't be able to provide audit and tax services or tax consulting services, because it's such a small world, what happened, we played what we call the musical chair. And basically, KPMG retained the audit client, which were the cash cow, I would say, and let PwC provide the tax consulting service. And I think this is something that also should be reflected somehow in your study. What I have to say. And Richard, this question is more for you. And I've started discussing with someone in Oxfam, US, which is called, his name is D.A. Jacobs, who's also working on impacting Big Fours on this work. And I think there's one dimension which kind of missed to a lot of analysis. And correct me if I'm wrong, but in a lot of places, for instance, in Luxembourg, when you want to provide service as a tax advisor, you have to register with the Institute of Entreprise, the equivalent of the ACCA or ACA. And I think there is a debate that is missing between us and them. Because at the end of the day, even though you and I, we know who are sitting within those institutions, they're the same people providing those tax services or the services. But at least as in authority, they have to be more accountable on the practice that the accounting firms are implementing. And I think this is maybe another dimension that needs to be more investigated on and probably.
And there was just one last question.
Hi, Will Snell. Building on Robert's point, and also a question and Rick's point about the pressure put on companies by the Action Act for 2011. To what extent do you think that LuxLeaks, Panama Papers have put equivalent PR pressure on Big Four, or have they been able to just shut that one off?
Well, that's a great range of questions. The paper box, we've been told we must reform it. The legislation is being put forward. We're in a transition arrangement, and I think it is 2019 when we'll move to the revised basis. We were just lately doing tax competition, let's be blunt. I don't think George Osborne even intended otherwise when he introduced it. So there is a revision process going on, the legislation has been passed. Under the same European rules, we are seeing changes to the double Irish, of course, but that's resulted in the Irish introducing a paper box, except they call it the knowledge box. Totally different, of course. So transition going on there. Northern Ireland is an area where I'm particularly interested because I am with Andrew Baker from Sheffield University now, what was at Queen's University Belfast. We were the only opposition basically to the change in the corporation tax rate in Northern Ireland. I don't know how many times I broadcast in Northern Ireland as a result, but a lot is the answer. The good thing about that is the BBC in Northern Ireland pay you for appearing on the radio, whereas most of the BBC don't. So I earn quite a bit as a consequence. I've argued frequently that the move in Northern Ireland is ridiculous. The 12.5% tax rate in Northern Ireland is, of course, on a totally different tax base to the Republic. The issue in the Republic was not the 12.5% rate, it was the fact that there was almost no tax base to be taxed anyway that was a big issue. So effective rates in the Republic of Ireland are much lower than 12.5%. The reality is that in the north they will be 12.5% or more. What the people in the north, and this process, by the way, was entirely driven by KPMG. We have to understand it was driven by the office of KPMG in Belfast, where 4 parts of the country were trial for tax fraud. I make the point just by coincidence, of course, but it's true. That process actually can't apply to a great many of the companies that might be attacked in. It can't be applied to the back office functions of companies that can be applied to financial services, which are most of the mobile capital that could be relocated to Northern Ireland as a result of a low tax rate. So it's a completely stupid situation. It will impoverish Northern Ireland. The question on attitudes is one which I think flows throughout what we're seeing here. One of the things that I've heard from the Big Four, from a very senior tax partner in one of the firms, I won't name which, is that, look, you're studying the Big Four. What is the Big Four? There is no such thing as the Big Four, in a sense, is the answer. There is a part of the Big Four in the UK, there's another part in other European countries, there's a different part in the USA, there's a different part in Canada, and there's another part in the Cayman Islands. We're not one firm. We just happen to share a name. We're not the same firm, though, and I ignore what they do. I can do whatever I like. I have no concern to them. They have no concern to me. We refer work to each other on a sort of scratch my back basis. We don't share profits, we don't share infrastructure, we don't share personnel, we don't share systems, although actually most of them say they do. But that's part of the legal fiction. Yeah, they've used this legal fiction to claim there isn't a firm, and yet when you go to their websites, you will find every single one of the Big Four has this lovely map which says, where are we? And mysteriously, for that purpose, they're all over the place. And yet, when it comes to legality, they are in a very limited environment. And I think that is one of those things, I explained to you earlier, I think that the whole of offshore requires you to believe in fairy tales. They're making up stories. They make up two different stories and can believe them simultaneously. It's like the 9-year-old in Father Christmas. They think they want to be old enough to pretend Father Christmas doesn't exist, but they want to hold on to the belief for long enough just in case he does and doesn't bring a present. And that's the fiction that the Big Four are playing offshore. So that is there. So again, this role is being played by the consulting divisions. Sometimes the consulting divisions are very closely related, but appear to be legally distinct. I think that is the game that is in part being played. You raised a very important point about regulatory capture. I think my own institute, the Institute of Chartered Accountants, is it really independent of the Big Four? I assure you, the chief executive, Michael Isarus, tells me they have no influence. Oh, come on, Michael. Let's not be silly. Of course they have big influence. How much influence? I think that's a very good area for work. LuxLeaks, who knows what's happening on LuxLeaks? I didn't know when I arrived this morning that I'd be making a submission to a Luxembourg court today. I have, it went at 4 o'clock, I've given an undertaking that if it's wrong, I will be spending Tuesday night in a jail in Luxembourg. I could be there for the next 10 years. The really worrying aspect of that is I could be banged up with John Christensen. That would worry me for 10 years. So, who knows? Has it damaged the Big Four? I think the Big Four are incredibly aware of the risks from this, much more than they would say publicly. I was in Luxembourg 2 or 3 weeks ago, and a partner from, actually I'll tell you it was KPMG, said, do you know the soft underbelly of the Big Four on this issue? Is the 21-year-olds who are joining from university. They don't want to take the risk of joining a firm who's going to put their career at prejudice by having been there. And if that firm is tainted by offshore, they will not want to join. And that's why the firms are realising they need so many young people, because they're the fodder of the audit business. But they're at risk of not being able to recruit those people, they believe, and that's why they will have to change. So let's target the students. Why do you think I'm teaching new subversives?
No, sorry, we will have to leave the room very soon, so I just want to give time for that. Let's do it.
I'll just go for one point, and that was about the tax consultants. I think you pretty much answered the question for me, but some of the literature does talk about the sort of revolving doors. So it would be quite interesting, another research project for someone to do is, you know, what's the movement of staff between these companies? What do I do goes on?
We're looking at that point of moving staff. Len Seabrook and Duncan Wigan at Copenhagen Business School, one of their specialities is actually drilling down into the CVs of the staff of the Big Four. They literally go down and say, what is their CV? Because people are very keen to put it on LinkedIn. And so you use LinkedIn to say who's moved where to where to where. And we'll build up maps of these connections, which will be quite interesting. Will make us deeply unpopular. As if that's anything new.
how very appropriate. I just saw on something news site that two accountants from KPMG have been sentenced today in the Supreme Court of Iceland, 9 months of suspended jail sentence for involvement in one of the shenanigans of the high flyers doing very appropriate.
Why suspension?
Thank you very much for the great panel and for the interest of everyone just spent this live in the afternoon to all these great questions.
We are going to move to ELG 03, which is where the canteen is at the end of the walkway. You will need to go on the right and walk downstairs or take a lift. Okay, just follow directions asked on the reception. It's going to be an Afrikaans spotlight, sponsored ELG 03, as in the dragon. You'll find it on the diagram. No.